This Shabbat we read about the infamous episode of the spies who enter into the land of Israel to evaluate it just prior to God presenting the promised land to his people. We know the terrible repercussions. 10 of the spies come back with a negative report, dishearten the people, and even as Joshua and Caleb, the two spies who came back with a positive report, tried to influence the people, they had been stirred, and they were so filled with animosity, they desired to stone Joshua and Caleb. Any dissenting view that was positive about Israel had to be cancelled. Does this sound familiar? But let's stick with the spies in the desert. And the question that we should ask is, surely if they were sent to bring back a report about Israel, they should not be condemned for being truthful. They simply wanted to report what they had seen and how they had perceived the land. And surely they should not be condemned and they should not be punished for being honest in their report. So why is it that they were punished? And why is this episode seen to be such a terrible event in the history of our people? So the commentaries speak about 4 areas of failure of the spies, which we can relate to in our own lives. The first is that when they returned, they didn't report back to Moses, who had sent them, to Moshe Rabbeinu, but they reported to the masses. So there was a clear desire to influence public opinion rather than to find solutions. They wanted to make sure that as many people as possible were brought into their understanding and into their camp. They wanted to influence what the masses would be thinking. And that is not genuine in trying to find a solution. It's not about holding a press conference to influence the public opinion. It's more about finding the details that are going to be solutions to the problem. The second area of weakness of the spies is the fact that they generalized. They did see giants in a certain region in Israel, but the way they reported it, we also saw Ra'inu Sham, we saw all over the land of Israel, these ogres, these giants. It's impossible to take the land because it's filled with citizens who are giants. When you generalize, you don't allow for solutions. Solutions are found by bringing responses to specifics, to details between husband and wife. When there is strife, always look for the specifics that can be addressed. When you generalize, he always, she always, you'll never find a solution. So the commentaries say they came back with a report, but they generalized a specific into an impossible problem to resolve and to solve. And the third area that was problematic was their negativity bias. Yes, they did mention that there was wonderful produce, there were elements of good in the land. But as our commentaries explain, they only mentioned the good to be a support to the negativity that would follow. It was only mentioned so that it would lend credibility to what they really wanted to say, which was negative. The good is lost in the negativity. And that again identifies that this is not about a genuine reporting, this is about an agenda. This is about an intentional desire to bring about a particular response. And finally, the commentaries explain to us that they had this negative self-image. We were in our own eyes as grasshoppers. And as a result of that, that is how they viewed us as grasshoppers. It's a problem when the Jew has a complex and the Jew has a view of him or herself as a grasshopper. When we see ourselves as not being worthy, when we see ourselves as weak, the me I see is the me I'll be, and we'll project our self-image onto the others around us who will view us no better than we see ourselves, and generally far worse. So these were weaknesses of the spies that clearly identified their intention and agenda. Does it sound familiar? So let's talk about present-day reporting on Israel. We know that the negativity is incessant. It is prolific. It is focused. It is discriminatory. It is vile, and it is viral. And we see all of these elements in the reporting that identify the agenda. There is an attempt to persuade the masses. There is an agenda clearly to get into the media, to utilize every opportunity of popular stars and opinions that could be proliferated, using threats and using marches and using the media as best as they can, there's an attempt not to deal with the facts as much as it is to influence the public opinion. And Israel has suffered so much from clearly an agenda to identify only the weaknesses and to be able to bring it to the masses in the most general way. And as a result of that, we've seen riots, and we've seen violence in the streets of America and the streets of England. We've seen the call for murder and the call for rape. It is clear when there is an agenda to influence the masses so negatively, it's going to have negative repercussions. Secondly, there's a generalization. We know that the events in Israel unfolded when there was a Supreme Court ruling about the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, in which there was a long-term High Court process which resulted in a decision that, in fact, the people occupying those buildings had to pay rent to the real owners who were Jewish. It was a civil matter, and it became not just the detail of the civil matter of a few homes in that area of East Jerusalem, but it became a political agenda, an attempt to force evictions across the whole of East Jerusalem. It was all about an entire desire to rid Israel of people who had legitimate rights to their homes. When it was a response on the Temple Mount to riots and to stones and rocks that had been collected and were being hurled, and there was an undoing of order, and the police responded to the detail that took place on top of the Temple Mount, it became an intolerance of religion. Israel desires to root out the possibility of praying differently to the Jews. We have an agenda against Islam, a generalization that is so untrue because the only people in that Middle East are the Israelis who have allowed and have been tolerant of all the different religions and allowed the practice of all different religions and the practice and the proliferation of all the different forms of serving God. Only Israel has allowed that to happen in the Middle East. To generalize from an event of unorder and lack of order on the Temple Mount as a desire to root out Islam is a generalization that clearly identifies the agenda of the protagonists against Israel. And then there's the bias, the negativity bias. Any good that Israel has done, any detail that can possibly be seen as good, is undermined by the labeling of Israel as an apartheid state. Israel, who has Arabs that serve as judges, who are leaders, who vote, who are politicians, who are able to speak freely, whatever they want to say is allowed to be said in Israel. Israel is identified as the apartheid state. The problems of negativity are seen in the hands of the Israelis rather than in the enemies. That negativity bias undermines what appears to be objective reporting about the Middle East and Israel. And finally, to my brothers and sisters, our own fold, who are the Jews of not in my name, the Jews who see themselves as grasshoppers because we have no political or religious or moral right to be where we are. It is all about us having created the problem. To those who see themselves as moral grasshoppers, as only wanting to usurp the place of others, it's certainly a time in which we need to understand that it's not Israel that initiated the last war, that you cannot condemn Israel for sending bombs into places from which rockets emerged from civilian areas against specifically the civilians of Israel. To see only the response rather than what initiated is such a terrible self-image of seeing ourselves as the aggressor when we're actually trying to defend ourselves. Nobody in their right mind would ever see the Apache Indians in America having a land dispute as being colonialists and a colonial power fighting the Americans. Nobody would assume to do that. And yet, Am Yisrael, having come home to their homeland, are always labeled as the apartheid regime, the colonial regime. If we ourselves view ourselves so negatively, how will the United Nations view the Jewish people? How will the people of the world view us if we cannot even view the legitimacy of our right to defend ourselves? We all know how the story of the spies ended. It was Joshua and Caleb, the lone voices, just a minority, who ultimately succeeded. And God took us into the promised land, and he gave us the promised land long before other religions were even thought of. And today we've come home. We've returned to Israel. Today we can celebrate that Am Yisrael Chai. May Hashem give us the strength to endure and to continue to grow and to be the agents of strength and peace in the Middle East. I wish everyone a Shabbat Shalom.